Hello and welcome back to this downplay Idealistic Crusade. This video is a review of the recently released Audible original from their Words+Music series. I think it's volume 27 of that series, and that's one from the legendary Pete Townshend entitled Somebody Saved Me. It's part of Amazon's ongoing series where they get legendary artists to come in and essentially do... it's really like a long form podcast for, I guess anywhere between 90 minutes to 2 hours or so. This is the only one I've listened to. I've heard of it. I just never, I don't really do a lot of, I don't do any Amazon services, and I don't use Audible, and I'm very much a print person. I like reading print books, or if I'm listening to any podcast, they're usually independent podcasts. But this just was too tempting because, of course, I'm a gigantic lifelong Who fan and total nerd for anything that Pete Townshend does. So as should be obvious behind me, of course. And also the fact that this show was covering primarily, it was Pete Townshend talking about the period that is usually least covered and least admired in the Who and his solo career. That is the after the death of Keith Moon, and talking about the tail end of the Who Are You album into the 1980s and the two 80s Who albums under the new lineup with Kenney Jones on their deal with Warner Brothers, whereas at the same time, Pete Townshend found himself signing a solo deal and having to write songs for both his solo career and the Who albums, and being expected to write way too many albums into far too little of a time, and also going into the late 80s with the 89 tour with the brass band section, and then talking about the building of the Tommy Broadway show, his Psycho Derelict album, his really intensive and terrible hand injury, which meant that he thought he wasn't going to be able to play guitar again for a while, and then leading into the late 90s and the reunion shows, and then the first sort of tours and leading up to the big world tour, where unfortunately that's when John Entwistle died in Las Vegas just before the tour was to start. So it's basically unfortunately bookended by the two major deaths in the band. Not to be super morbid, but it is a period of time that usually gets glossed over, and there is fantastic material in all of them, even though it was a heck of a lot of ups and downs in that time period. So again, you're basically starting from 1978 and Who Are You, which is one of the truly underrated albums in the Who canon, even though it is lighter on guitar, heavier on synthesizer. There's a lot of John Entwistle songs on here, as opposed to being usually much more Townshend-led in terms of the composition. And of course, you can tell that Keith Moon was not in the best of physical shape, and in fact, the recording sessions took longer and were a lot more difficult because he was really bad off physically. But it is a great record in spite of all that. And actually, I think because of a lot of that, it is sort of a different type of experience. So it's this show, this podcast episode, if you will, is starting from this point, just before Keith Moon's untimely death, then going into the initial 79 tours. And that, of course, unfortunately means also talking about the Cincinnati tragedy that happened at the Who concert. And that just sent the entire band into a tailspin into the 1980s, where they had the Warner Brothers deal start. And to be honest, getting into territory that even fewer fans talk about or stick up for, I am a giant fan of the 1980s record, starting with 1981's Face Dances, which is a bit of a departure sonically, but it's a beautifully produced album that is horrendously underrated and usually trash talked quite a bit, but not as much as the follow-up, which was unfortunately the last album before the original breakup after this release in 82 of It's Hard, which is a darker record than Face Dances. And honestly, it is... I hate when people just totally trash on the two 80s Who albums, because I do feel there is fantastic material there. But I will agree with the common sort of complaint and thought that some say that Townshend was putting his best material into his solo efforts instead of the Who efforts. And I think it was, as he says and addresses in this episode, this podcast, that he was basically stretched too thin, and so what wouldn't get selected for the Who album would go on his solo records, or if he had it ready for his solo record, he would put it there, and if he didn't think that it fit on a Who album. And it kind of sort of makes sense, but I think a lot of fans have thought for a long time, and I do think there is some truth to the idea that you can imagine some of Pete's solo cuts and imagine them as Who tracks, and then vice versa, some of the Who tracks on these two albums, imagine them more as Pete Townshend solo tracks. And I think that was just because he was really stretched too thin, and ultimately, the decided to disband the Who in '82, and then focus more on his solo career. And you get the insider's perspective of that. There is some of this in his autobiography, published a number of years ago, that I have here, Who I Am, but it's not often that this era of the band's history and his solo era, it's not often that it's gone over, and it's very rare that people even talk about Pete's solo records, because they're really great. And if you're a fan of The Who, you're already most likely a giant fan of Pete Townshend. And all the Who member solo records have great stuff on them. Even Keith Moon's sort of mixture of joke, novelty, interesting, all over the place solo album has its charms. But Pete's solo output is filled with great gems and classics, and you maybe only hear Let My Love Open the Door, and that's about it, unfortunately, which is really a shame, because there's fantastic tracks on there. And what's great about this Words and Music series is you'll actually get certain songs or selections of songs played in there. And at first I thought it was just going to be, just little chapter bookends, and then it'd be like, oh, they just play the latest remaster of that song from the album version. But it's not just that. It's actually mostly, it's like you're sitting in Pete Townshend's home studio, and he's talking to you and telling you about this stuff, and in a long form, off the cuff type way, because there's no video footage, it's audio only. And then you realize that some of these are just in the studio, and they're being done right now. So it's a nice sort of direct flow from the flow of conversation and into said song, and it's a lot of solo numbers mixed in with some Who tracks as well, but it's not just the same big hits that everybody knows, the sort of tried and true ones to trot out. No, these are some deeper ones, and let's put it this way, Don't Let Go of the Coat is one of them, as is probably my favorite track from Pete's solo career. It's hard to pick just one, but I have a great fondness for Slit Skirts from All the Best Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes. It's one of his greatest solo songs, and it kills me that nobody knows it. So it was great to hear that in there as well. So it was really a fun listen. It clocks in at a little bit over 2 hours, and to be honest, when it was done, I was like, is that just part one? I need more. Even though I knew a lot of the in and out details just as a fan in general, it was great hearing them in this way. And I really enjoyed this very no frills but longer form type experience, but directly between artist and listeners. It's a little bit more participatory than your traditional talking head interview type extra piece that you might get on a DVD with an album release nowadays, where there's like a little 20-minute interview. And because there is no video, it is a little bit more participatory, because you're just listening to the experience as you would like a radio interview. But again, it's like you're just in the studio with them, and there's no distractions. And because there's no video, I think people feel much freer to just talk amongst as if they're just talking to somebody in the room with them. There's no worrying about, do you look good that day, so on and so forth, and getting set up for a video shoot. And again, because it's a little over 2 hours and it is nicely broken up into chapters, it's a good solid listen, and you don't want to stop listening to it. So I pretty much listened to it straight through. It is free right now. It just premiered literally this month, I think on the 6th. So I had no idea. I just saw it because I guess in my Who Travels it popped up, and I just started listening to it immediately and could not turn it off. So that's why I wanted to do a video about it. I think it's free a little bit longer. I guess they do free premieres every once in a while, but otherwise you have to have an Audible subscription. I don't know if it's free for everyone right now, but it seems like it is. They're always very non-descriptive about things like that. So I believe it's free for a limited time. So I encourage any Who fans, any Pete Townshend fans to go check it out. It's a great listen. I wish you could purchase it, but they like to keep things like that locked behind subscription packages. But it's a fantastic listen, and again, it is a must if you're a Who fan or a Pete Townshend fan. So I just wanted to talk about it a little bit because it was far better than I thought it was going to be, and I think that Pete Townshend himself really enjoyed it because you could hear it in his voice. So he didn't just do the traditional same stories and anecdotes. So it was a really nice, rewarding listen. And as a diehard fan, it was great to have something that was different than the usual same old interview type pieces. And of course, you can tell I'm a diehard fan. I had trouble squeezing in as much of my Pete solo album collection as I could. I couldn't even fit the last Who records on here, and of course getting the book as well. And I'm also a great fan of the Psycho Derelict album. I know I'm really an outlier on that one. And if I had to choose if I had to choose the best Pete solo record, it's very, very hard. I'd probably have to give the nod to White City because it's just a wonderfully recorded album. I love the themes of it. It's a darker album. It's got some more anger in it. But again, it's hard to choose just one. And I do have to say I think Pete Townshend is the greatest songwriter and musician who's ever lived, but I am biased. I admit my bias, but basically, if anything that Pete Townshend does, or either with the Who or in terms of solo work, I at least try to give a listen to it and check it out because I think anything he does is worthwhile. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this new Audible episode in their Words and Music series. I'd be curious to check out some of the others. Again, this is number 27, and it seems they try to do a couple a year. I like these longer form type things, and you can see they're definitely trying to get more into the podcast type realm. But it was really fun and rewarding, and again, I encourage any fans to check it out, or even if you're maybe more of a passing Who fan and you're just curious to know more, or if you don't know too much about the last few years of the band in the late 70s, and then if you're not really aware or too knowledgeable about the 80s albums, I'd give it a shot. I think it's really rewarding, and again, you can really tell that Pete Townshend is really digging a bit deeper and kind of being a little surprised at what's coming out and enjoying the process. So again, it's a more intimate and much more far-reaching thing than most of the usual interviews. So as always, I'd love to hear your comments if you're a Who fan or a Pete fan, or if you've heard this episode or were curious about checking it out, definitely let me know in the comments below. And I'd like to say, whatever you do, keep windmilling always. Thanks ever so much for watching.